Okay, so we might just kick off now. I know we've got people still joining us, and that's okay. They'll, I'm sure, pick it up as we go along. So yeah, thanks for everyone for joining. We've had a pretty overwhelming response. We've had 238 people register. So I think that shows the level of interest in this type of event, and we really hope that this can be the first of many in a series of similar events with Indigenous-led panels speaking on the issues that are important to them and the issues that are important to all Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So I might start by just acknowledging the lands that we're all meeting on from wherever you're dialing in across Australia. I'm in Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. So yeah, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners here and their continuing connection to land, sea and community for over 70,000 years, and the ongoing contribution that Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples make to the Canberra region. It's something that's very important to the United Nations Association and to the UN itself. So we released our first reconciliation action plan last year, and through that we've already been able to have an intern in our national office in Malachi, who's our moderator today, with support of the Career Trackers program. So that's been something really great that we've been able to do that I think has made a real impact. So delighted that Malachi can be joining us here today, and look forward to his continuing involvement with the UNAA. And obviously with COVID, maybe we haven't been able to do all the things we wanted to, but that's, like the rest of the world. So really looking forward to having this event today and doing more in the future. I'll just touch on a couple of things quickly and then hand over to Malachi, who's going to be our MC today. And Mal will be asking questions of Tanya and Joe initially, just 5 or 6 or so, and then we'll hand over to you, the audience, because we really want to hear from you on the issues that are important to you, and make sure that you have a chance to share your views, which you'll be able to do through the chat. And we know through some of the questions that we've been receiving through your registrations that there's a lot of interest and a lot that we can cover there. Something that I did want to mention is the Raise the Age campaign, which is something the UN has been really strong on. And Australia isn't a country that has come on board and raised the age, with the notable exception just in the last day or so of the ACT, which has raised the age of criminal responsibility to 14, just in the ACT. But for the rest of Australia, and despite the campaigns and a lot of efforts from many good people over a long period of time, the age of criminal responsibility remains at 10 in other jurisdictions in Australia. So that lags behind the global median age of 14, which is the age that the UN is advocating to raise to. So that's something that we'll continue to be strong on, and we'll welcome your views if you want to share through the chat or through questions as we go. But yeah, it's great that at least the ACT has been able to lead in that area. And we'd also like to thank the ACT government for its support of this event, and its support of our internship program with Career Trackers, through which we'll be able to bring Malachi on board. I'll just give you a bit of an introduction on the UNAA, and then we'll jump in and hand over to Mal for the questions. So the UNAA is the peak body for promoting the United Nations in Australia, and we do that through a focus on some of those issues which are both important to Australia and Australians, but also where there's perhaps a gap between how Australia is performing, or maybe the awareness in the community versus what maybe the UN advocates or the international expectation. So there are some of the issues like climate change, which unfortunately Australia is lagging behind. reconciliation would certainly be one, and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Australia doesn't have a strong record there, and in fact, a long way to go, and we continue to see progress which isn't anywhere near as fast as we would like in, I suppose, if you term closing the gap, which can be a bit of a controversial term, and we'll get into the closing a gap agenda itself through this meeting. The rights of refugees and asylum seekers, and we sort of know what Australia's policy and performance there has been. I think there's a big opportunity in the future on refugees and asylum seekers and on all issues, and in the response to COVID-19 for Australia to really be a world leader and a leader in the region, rather than a country which, through its actions, isn't supporting other nations and a global or regional response. So those three issues, and also gender equality is probably one in particular where there's a perception that Australia is doing quite well or is in fact a world leader. And we know that that's just not the case, in particular in comparison to other first world countries or developed nations. So Australia's about 38th in the world on gender equality, and in certain areas moving backwards. And certainly in terms of women in leadership, has a very, very long way to go. And that all fits within the broader UN agenda, the 2030 agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. So to 2030, there's 17 goals that the UN has set out, which can change the world and move toward a safer, fairer, more sustainable world. So that UN broader agenda and those UN goals, together with some of those specific issues, are what the UNAA advocates on. And we do that through over 150 events each year all across Australia. So I think that's about enough from me, and more of it might come out in the conversation. But yeah, really looking forward to this event, and thanks again so much for you all joining us today. I'll hand over now to Malachi, and look forward to the discussion.
Hey everybody, I just want to acknowledge the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains region as it's known today. Pay my respects to their continued relationship to country, language, law, culture. Acknowledge their ancestors and their elders, past and present. And I just want to extend those respects to all the First Nations people in attendance here today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and our First Nations friends who we stand in solidarity with from overseas. So I'll just introduce myself quickly. My name is Malachi Mulyacic. I'm a Gunya man. My people are from Southwest Queensland. I've just recently completed a Bachelor of Business, major in Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and I was very lucky that I got to travel and study in Fiji, Thailand, Canada, America, and China. And part of that, I was working at the UNDP there in Thailand, and was also fortunate to, at the end of my degree, to do an internship here with the UNAA. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll just hand it over to Joe Morrison and Tanya Hosh, and they'll be able to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Malachi. I'm Joe Morrison. I'm of Dargaman and Wild descent from Northern Australia. I'm on the lands of the Wathaurong people here in Victoria, but my history is that I've worked with Indigenous people in Northern Australia, Northern Development, land rights and caring for country and other movements over the last 30 years, and more recently working with Indigenous people of collectively held territories in other parts of the world. So great to be here and look forward to the webinar.
Hi, I'm Tanya Hosh. I'm coming in from the traditional lands of the Larrakia people in Darwin. It feels strange to be in Darwin without an opportunity to see you, Joe. I'm here working on the Sir Douglas Nicholls round for the AFL, which is going to have a great couple of days of football here in the Territory. I'm a Torres Strait Islander. I actually live in Adelaide. It's my first time travelling in about 6 months due to COVID. I'm really pleased to have the ability to be associated with the United Nations Association of Australia and the important work that they're trying to lead, and really thrilled to be sharing a platform with Joe, someone who has immense wisdom and knowledge and great integrity, and someone who I look up to very much.
Thank you very much, Joe and Tanya. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping as well. Why don't you let us know what country you're tuning in from? Just drop us a comment. And as well too, if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask a panel, you can also submit those questions below. There also may be an opportunity that we can bring you in and turn your video on, and you'll be able to ask that question in person. If not, just submit it below. We have had a lot of questions submitted over the course of the registrations and different topics. So thank you very much to everybody who engaged in that way. And I think we'll jump into it with the first question here is regarding the new Closing the Gap strategy, which has had a pretty mixed reception. So I want to ask the panel here, what do you see as the most important outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that we should all collectively be aiming to achieve? How do we better track that progress?
Thanks for that question. First of all, I'd like to put some context into it in terms of my experience and how I sort of epitomise the sort of history of Indigenous rights and movements here in Australia. And even though I come from Northern Australia, I think it's pretty relevant across the country. And that is that we've spent the last 40 to 50 years in a land rights and native title process, going through that, which has in effect distracted a lot of us as a people in relation to other matters that are important for us. And now we're dealing with this, I think, this public policy mess that's sort of abounding our lives and our futures, and this sort of disconnect between Indigenous people and the state. And I think it's pretty clear, at least in my mind and my experience, that the struggle of land rights and native title, even though that continues in many ways, has in fact distracted us a lot as a people. And if you were to look at the existing situation in the Northern Territory, where there's a serious disconnect between Aboriginal voters and people who are, living in the northern suburbs of Darwin and Alice Springs and Katherine, for example, there is enormous disconnect. The fact that people are not voting in this upcoming election, which is due to be held tomorrow. But back to the issue of closing the gap, I think firstly that, there's an enormous amount of work that's been done by all of those people and institutions involved in it. But I think it's really missing in the fact that it's dealing with the relations with the state. It's not finding a solution, Indigenous-led solution to our futures. And that's, for me, that's part of, I think, the challenge that the Closing the Gap strategy is finding itself. And there's no doubt that we need to, in fact, reduce incarceration rates and those sorts of things. But I think also we need to spend a lot of time working out what it is that Indigenous people want and how we want to implement those changes across the nation. And unfortunately, for me, Closing the Gap doesn't go down that path far enough. So I think, and I've said for a long time, that we really need to, as a people, reset the relationship between ourselves and the settler society, including governments and others that are living here, for us to be able to reimagine what that future might look like. And that's a complex thing to do. It's easy to say, but I think at the end of the day, that we really need to, as a people, work out what our strategy, our collective strategy is as a people, and where we want to see our futures go, and not just be reactive to governments, public policy, and the poor state of affairs that we find ourselves in at a public policy level.
Lots of excellent points. Really agree with what Joe is saying there. I think, one of the things to always be cognizant of is when you're trying to impact change at this kind of level, to really try and reach into the systemic hurdles that get in the way of the delivery of, really improving the situation and lived experience of First Peoples in Australia, that it's always going to be incredibly challenging to come up with a solution, particularly one that is brokered with government, that suits everybody equally. And I think that the point that Joe's making in relation to, doing this without proper systems of representation in Australia, with the right degrees of transparency and consultation is seriously lacking. So I think it's important to say that, you know, the approach that has been taken was very thorough, I believe. I know that I participated in some of the consultation. I know that the intention was to be as inclusive as possible. That's very difficult to do. I think the model of allowing or having Aboriginal people negotiating direct rather than being given a document from government is an incredible step forward. So I do want to applaud the people that have helped to facilitate that. But we all know that there's still so much work that has to come. And, you know, as always, where the rubber hits the road is the execution. So, you know, I definitely recognise a huge amount of work would have gone into being able to be at the table directly with the Prime Minister, having these conversations, but it's in the execution. And I think the sort of goodwill and commitment that has to be followed through in terms of making sure that there's real delivery on the ground.
Definitely very important. Sometimes we definitely lack that too, most times. The next question is regarding self-determination and sovereignty. And Joe, maybe this is something, you know, that pertains to your experience. We hear those terms thrown around a lot in Indigenous and non-Indigenous circles. What do these actually mean, and what are those tangible outcomes?
Thanks, Mel. I mean, and I'm sure there's many people on this webinar that have got very complicated and sophisticated views about those two topics. But from my experience, I can say that, you know, self-determination is both a concept that we aspire to as a people, but it's an ongoing process of choice. In relation to sovereignty, I recall an elder that I used to work with in the Northern Territory that when I talked to him about the notion of sovereignty in the legal context, he said that he feels sovereign in his lands every day, and so he doesn't worry about the government and other influences. Now, that's not shared with all people, of course, but as an example, that's one individual that sort of expresses how he feels about sovereignty. We've seen calls for sovereignty here in Australia, and if anyone understands the nature of how the British settled this nation based on the papal bulls and this notion of conquest, and the fact that it was the British that arrived here under instructions from the King at the time, and those instructions weren't adhered to, and in fact weren't known about until, you know, in recent decades, says a lot about the nation state and its maturity to have conversations about Indigenous self-determination. And I think what we've seen, particularly from the Northern Territory experience, is that self-determination has gone out the door a long time ago, and it's no longer about self-determination for Indigenous people. And we've seen that exercised in the Northern Territory intervention and other forms of public policy that have sought to control the lives of Indigenous peoples. This isn't unique to the Northern Territory, of course. This happens in all jurisdictions here, and it happens in many other places that we've seen recently with the Black Lives Matter movements and other movements around the world. So there's a general sort of unsettlement in relation to how Indigenous people react and respond, but also their aspirations to self-determine their futures and to feel like they can actually take control of their lives. There are many jurisdictions in Australia that are embarking on treaty-making processes, and whether people appreciate those or not, I think they are by design a mechanism by which people can engage in a process to have better control over their lives and to be more self-determined. But obviously the devil's always going to be in the detail of those negotiations. But I think it's been a long time coming from the time that the band Yothu Yindi sung the song Treaty to us actually having any form of treaties here. And I think, for me, I think that Indigenous people really need to remain vigilant and don't settle for the lowest common denominator when it comes to making agreements with the state that has taken control of their lives. There is many things that people need to consider, and they need to consider those things carefully, noting that in some other countries of the world, like Canada, some of those processes have been going on for 20 or 30 years. So they are long-term processes, and they can, in fact, be very difficult conversations to have, but nonetheless they are a means by which people can achieve some form of self-determined futures for themselves, and they can feel sovereign about themselves.
Don't really think I can add anything. That was a very thorough response. Great insights.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. And yeah, definitely. I mean, the process for treaty seems to be a very complicated one. From my time in Canada, people often identify from which treaty section they're from, along with their mob's name, and not all of those were favourable outcomes. So I guess the leadership going into those treaty discussions is very important as well. There's also been a lot of discussion recently, as we know, around copyright and ownership of the Aboriginal flag. For those that might not be aware, what's the issue there, and how are we going to come forward from this one?
Yeah, thanks, Mal. Very topical. I don't think that all Australians actually appreciate that both the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags are official flags of Australia and contained in our Flags Act. So we don't just have one official flag, we actually officially have three, and a lot of people don't recognise that. Harold Thomas, a Lurich man from Central Australia, designed the flag. It was first flown in 1971. As I understand it, it was designed to really create an emblem under which land rights was being fought for, and it very quickly became adopted as a sign of struggle, sign of cultural pride, and a sign of recognition of who the First Peoples were and their connection to land and their rights to that land as the First Peoples of Australia. You know, I think increasingly over the years, you know, if you see one flag flown, you'll see all three, and that's appropriate because, as I said, we've got three official flags. For some time now, if you want to purchase the Aboriginal flag as it stands as a flag to go on a flagpole or a miniature version that might come on a wooden stick, the licence agreement for purchasing that flag has been in place for a number of years, and I think largely well observed, and that's through Flag World. So that's been in place for a number of years. Harold Thomas has exercised his legal rights and had them endorsed in court in terms of his copyright as the original artist. Since then, he has entered into an agreement with a company called WAM Clothing, who have become the licensee. Now, no one really knows the details of that license agreement between WAM and Harold Thomas because that's a confidential legal document, of course. However, I'm acutely aware of it because I work at the Australian Football League, and we did receive a cease and desist notice from WAM Clothing on the eve of Sir Doug Nicholls round last year. For a number of years, the AFL has made sure that the centre circle of all our games in Sir Doug Nicholls round were painted in the colours of the Aboriginal flag. Toyota, as our major partner, have paid a heavy fee to have their emblem in the centre circle, and they've always freely given it up for this round to be replaced with the Aboriginal flag. The cease and desist notice that arrived last year came very late in relation to notice period to remove the flag from the centre circle. And so we were legally obligated to either quickly remove that work or pay a fee. Removing the work, for those of you who are not AFL tragics, there's a lot of issues around turf, quality of turf, all those sorts of things. Painting the grass and the grounds does do damage to the ground, and so to quickly remove those colours was not really an option. So we did have to enter into an agreement. As a consequence of that, it was just a one-off, and we then took this issue to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Council of the AFL. They deliberated over this issue for a number of months, and they recommended to the AFL that we stand in solidarity with Aboriginal people who were understandably, deeply confused and frustrated at their lack of access of a flag that they feel represents them. Now, when we're talking about this, it's my understanding, I'm not a intellectual property or copyright expert and not even a lawyer, but the understanding is that this use of the licence agreement would pertain to whether you've got the Aboriginal flag on your email signature block, for example. So they have the digital rights of the flag as well. It pertains to putting the flag on a t-shirt, a pair of earrings, a pair of socks, a sticker, a badge on a beanie, whatever it may be. So we're not talking about flags as per flagpoles, but we're talking about any other representation of the flag. So the AFL took on the recommendations of the Advisory Council. We're very confident that they took into account all of the issues and want us to stand in solidarity with Aboriginal people until there's a resolution brought to bear on this issue. I understand that the federal government is in negotiations with Harold Thomas and WAM Clothing. Obviously, I'm not party to any of that, but I do hope it's resolved very quickly. It's an important symbol for Aboriginal people, and I think increasingly it's a much loved symbol by a number of, growing numbers of Australians who care about Aboriginal people, Aboriginal rights, and the place of the First Peoples in their own land.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And it's been, for those who may have just recently heard about the issue, now that a lot of the major sporting codes are, having the Indigenous round, this is something that's been, very strong topic in the community for the past year, and it's affected a lot of people I know personally who run Indigenous businesses and who use the flag on their clothing and things like that. They're all being sent cease and desist and being told, hey, you don't own that flag anymore, and you're not able to use it unless, so we're really hoping that one, we can have some light shed and that we can make some progress with that one. The next one is to do with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Commonly, the acronym is UNDRIP. We've actually had quite a few questions from attendees about this one in regards to the UN. It's around improving understanding and better establishing and ultimately protecting those rights that are enshrined in UNDRIP here in Australia. How do we better go about doing that?
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think the UNDRIP process is people who would be aware of it. That took a very long period of time for that to come into existence. Lots of negotiations that went over decades, in fact, by Indigenous leaders at an international level through the UN, and to finally have that ratified and then adopted by some countries, was a great achievement. The unfortunate part about it is that even though some countries might be in support of it, such as Australia, they have not necessarily changed that or put that into practice through changes to legislation and so forth. And I think one of the most common ones is around sort of free, prior and informed consent and the provisions for consultation, particularly when it relates to development. And we still unfortunately don't see those things being put into place. But again, I go back to the processes that are underway, at least in 3 jurisdictions around treaty making. And even though where I come from, the Aboriginal Land Rights Act has in fact empowered that process to be put into legislation, it's not necessarily the same in other jurisdictions. So there are some enormous gaps. There are many Indigenous institutions that have also adopted that. And there are, scatterings of non-Indigenous institutions around the country that have adopted those, or at least some of those articles, not all of those articles in UNDRIP. So it's a very complicated process, but effectively, unfortunately, that's not necessarily put into laws or practices by governments, by the industry, and unfortunately, we've seen the destruction of significant and substantial globally standout heritage sites in the Pilbara and Western Australia, which reminds us of the country that we live in, effectively, that unfortunately in this day and age that mining and other forms of activity on lands can still occur in a way that's destructive to people's culture and their long-standing traditions. And so there's a long way to go, I think, for the Australian government and state and territory governments to adopt that in any meaningful fashion. But given the lack of traction with the Uluru Statement and the uptake of that and the unfortunate sort of political discourse that takes place in this country around that, I think it's fair to say that it's a long way off from that being adopted in any substantial form, other than outside perhaps the agreement making processes that are in those jurisdictions around making treaties. So, Mal, the questions. One, I think that, I think all Indigenous people would like to see more adoption of those articles, given the long-standing history, and that's the case in other countries around the world with Indigenous peoples as well. But unfortunately, Australia is a substantial lagger when it comes to adopting that and putting that into practice.
Definitely. There's issues there with, accountability and keeping our representatives accountable. And it actually leads into the next question, which is about that recognition. We often, like you've said, we're a laggard in many categories, and we often see that. And then you go overseas to these international conferences and speak to other Indigenous people and First Nations people from around the world. And oftentimes for me, it's sometimes really disappointing to meet people from, other less developed countries who are fighting against the same issues that, and the UN has actually condemned the treatment of our people on an international level. And back to exactly what you're saying is that we're very far behind in some categories. So the next question is, how do we bridge that gap between sometimes well-intentioned and sometimes not well-intentioned, but ultimately tokenistic recognition, like signing those documents and then not backing it up, and real representation and real change?
Yeah, again, it's a very difficult thing, isn't it? We've seen, with the UNAA here in Australia that, resourcing is always an issue. But regardless of the frustration that some may feel about the UN, it does play a critical role in Indigenous people's journeys for their recognition of their rights. And going back to what I said earlier about, a lot of Australia is still locked in this sort of determination era when we haven't really focused on a post-determination. And going back to closing the gap, one of the indicators that was created in closing the gap was around settling native title claims. When you actually analyse the figure that they put there, it's actually less than what is currently being settled. And so, you have to ask the question of how our representatives, our peak organisations and bodies, and our leaders come about some of these indicators, but also how do we enable Indigenous people at a local level and regional level to be empowered to be able to take better controls of their lives? And I think, going back to my earlier comment, I really believe that Indigenous people have got to seriously think about coming together and developing some form of a strategy to reset the relationship amongst themselves, but also with the settler society. And until we do that, we're going to be in this sort of constant sort of cycle of reacting to third parties, reacting to governments, and reacting to other people and institutions that have views about how Indigenous people, who are very different in many ways, how they want to perform their lives. So there's a long way to go in terms of recognition, as we've seen with the outcome of the Uluru Statement and the comprehensive process that took place for that, but also the previous process around recognition that Tanya was a part of as well. So, Australia unfortunately hasn't reached the level of maturity that one would like to see it, 240 odd years after the arrival of the British, to be able to have a conversation about how the British arrived here and how their First Nations might want to determine their own futures.
Tanya, is there anything you want to add there, or that's all good?
Look, I think it's a huge conversation. I think all I would probably think to add is that, I think we lack the framework structures to enable successful negotiation outcomes stemming from our status as First Peoples and not really being able to sit at the table as equals. And that is a huge concern. When I think about the really great work that people are pursuing around treaty, around Australia, one of the things that concerns me is the absence of a national framework and benchmark, given that every state and territory has a very different ability to compensate and resource such agreements appropriately. I do fear that some people will fare far worse than others and end up in a situation where they're locked into an agreement that perhaps does not do them justice because of the circumstances that the state that they're part of finds themselves in. I think in this post-COVID recovery, and who knows when that will even start, is going to have massive ramifications from an economic situation in terms of any kind of economic modelling that would be needing to be designed to properly compensate and recognise the loss of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to their lands and waters, and all of their intellectual, cultural, social rights. So I do worry about the potential that some of these things could get rushed through. I think that when you look at some of the content that's being asked for in relation to any number of things, whether it's the close the gap measures, whether it is a voice to Parliament and the Uluru Statement, whether it is potential treaty negotiations, what I do fear is a rush at some point, because I think that the claims are pretty modest. And if I was in a situation with some of the claims, I'd think, all right, let's lock this down because it could be so much bigger. And I do feel concerned about the lack of transparency and understanding across the whole nation about what does need to be resolved in terms of those foundational relationships. And I think while that goes unresolved, then it's going to make it very difficult to get fair, equitable outcomes for First Peoples in any agreement making.
I'll just add to that. I mean, Tanya raised a very pertinent point, I think, which is we currently find ourselves in, and now sort of living in Victoria with the lockdowns here really reminds you of the failure of the sort of, the capitalist economy, and in many other parts of the world where Indigenous peoples have had customary economies. It really reminds you that there needs to be a greater sort of discussion about the balance between people engaging in the market and also people being overly reliant on those markets in those supply chains, but more locally, able to be sustainable in many ways. And we've seen, the Caring for Country movement here in Australia, which is probably one of the most biggest success stories in Australia, where Indigenous people have taken control of the management of their lands. And I hope there's an opportunity in the southeast bushfires outcome. But I think there really needs to be a question asked about returning to the same old economic drivers that we've had, that is the over-reliant on extractive industries and not enough effort and design around supporting local economies. And that's, I think, part of the discussion that's very applicable here in terms of Indigenous rights, the ability to feel, sovereign in your own country, to be able to determine your future by generating your own incomes rather than being normalised, so to speak, and connected into the market economy. I think there should be greater choices for Indigenous people.
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. And I think that the number is about 80% of the world's biodiversity that First Nation people globally care for. So there are other solutions there. They do exist. And I think actually too, in the wake of the bushfires, it's been really, really beautiful to see on the South Coast that potentially more, land management is being handed back to Indigenous people. And there's been, although not a blatant admittance, but an admittance within policy that says, hey, maybe we're not the best people to be doing this. And, you know, we will start to give back, which I think is very important. They're still lacking a great deal of Indigenous representation in leadership in international spaces such as the UN, and especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I know that when I worked on the Indigenous conference over there at the UNDP in Thailand, it was like a lot of the people within that space were only meeting Indigenous people for the first time, and I was most definitely one of the only Aboriginal people that they'd ever met. How do those big international organisations, and even the smaller ones that people are a part of on this call, how do they work to ensure that the staff and representatives, that the leaders working there, actually support the diversity of the communities that they're working to engage and support? You know, how do they involve us and provide that seat at the table?
I might jump in first on this one, Joe. I think, you know, to me, key to getting that right starts where the decisions are made. I'm a massive advocate for the fact that we do need Indigenous people at the levels of the highest governance of all of these structures. It makes a huge difference if you're at the table where the main decisions are made. It does focus the mind. People can say it's tokenistic. Maybe it is, but I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that I've used tokenism to great effect on many occasions. You can't have that impact if you're not at the table. So I think that those pathways and opportunities are not complicated to put in place, but we don't have structures that create accountability about whether you achieve that or not. And one thing that I do know is that when you are on a board or as an executive of an organisation, even if you are the only Indigenous person there, it gives you an opportunity to demand accountability on these sorts of measures in a way that means that people can't just look the other way, say it's too hard. We know that it's entirely possible to ensure this kind of representation. We know that it is not difficult to find appropriately qualified, talented, skilled people with traditional skills and knowledge on top of any other qualification you might seek to look for, who can adequately represent on these issues. And you know, I do think that it is a huge lapse to see some of these major, whether they be global or domestic policy issues, still be discussed without Aboriginal people, Torres Strait Islander people at the table. The one that stands out really strongly for me is climate change. I think it's extraordinarily disturbing that we don't have Indigenous representation and leadership embedded at every level of the global and domestic climate change and climate policy conversation, including sustainability issues as well, more broadly. I know this is an area where Joe has a lot of expertise, and anyone that comes to me to say, you're interested in being part of this climate conversation, I'll send them Joe's way. But, you know, to continue to overlook the accountability at the governance level of all of these institutions, I think is the reason that we won't see change in this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, definitely agree with everything you said. And like you said, with that seat at the table, you've got peoples globally who are caring for that country, have a continued relationship to that country dating back potentially 80,000 years, who have solutions to these problems and are living solutions to these problems. And these people are just, you know, not contacted and not thought of. So sometimes it does make you wonder. Formally, that is actually the end of our preset questions, but we do have another 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the audience. So we've got here a bit of building on Jess and Naomi's points. What are some other things people on this call can do? People here want to know how they can help. How can they all support better Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities?
I can have a quick crack because I was just responding to one of the questions there, which is interrelated. You know, what's going on in Australia? There's lots of reforms going on. We've recently seen the EPBC Act, which is our national environmental legislation, being reviewed, and there was a question about the issue of heritage protection. That is, in fact, you know, an opportunity to influence that in terms of dealing with the sort of the dysfunction that takes place at a state level, particularly in the West, in Western Australia, as it relates to protecting heritage and those agreements that are negotiated between native title holders and mining companies. So I think there are a number of those things, but I think also that Indigenous people themselves can, in fact, you know, who are really good storytellers, find platforms to be able to tell their stories a lot better. And non-Indigenous people could, in fact, reach out and access some of those storytelling platforms as well. And there's more and more content being put out there in social media and the like. And I think, you know, that process, while it might be slow, is in effect a good way in which both parties, that is Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can in fact connect and better understand each other, you know, without getting tangled up, of course, in sort of political arguments. So I think just better communication, understanding of each other's positions, but also noting that there is a number of matters afoot at the moment. The EPBC Act review, there's the Northern Development Agenda in Northern Australia, and there's many other things going on with the inquiry into bushfires in South East Australia as well, where Indigenous people can be better placed.
I definitely agree with that. I think the only other point I would make is to remember that, you know, collectively to use your voice to let the political realm know that you're an Australian who cares about these issues. For a very long time, parties have not had to take these issues into account because they haven't had any sort of pushback in the polls in relation to it. I think it's really important to be clear about what you stand for and what you think is important. And I do understand that there are times where non-Indigenous people are very reluctant to put themselves in a position where it may be perceived that they're speaking on behalf of Indigenous people or speaking over the top of. But I think that there are many organisations and institutions around the country that you can be an ally to on whatever it is that you think matters most to you in terms of where you'd like to make a contribution, and to seek out partnerships and relationships, and whether you can do that as part of your workplace or any other sort of network that you're part of, to have those sorts of partnerships to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership know that you will be there, and they know that you will stand with them, and they know when you will stand with them or when you feel like perhaps you wouldn't. It's so, you can spend so much time, I think, you know, the call on the time of Indigenous leaders is overwhelmingly large, with really difficult issues to navigate, even amongst your own people. And so I think thinking about how you can be an ally and, you know, respond to the call to action when required is a really, really practical way to have assistance. And just read, you know, read Indigenous writers, read what it is that they have to say, listen to what they're saying, and, you know, ask all the questions you need to ask, but just keep yourself informed, and remember that there's far more of you than there is of us, and your voice really matters when it comes to demonstrating to the country and the political class that we will no longer tolerate the First Peoples of the country being so disenfranchised and disadvantaged.
Thank you very much. There is another question here from Shira Lee Lawson, who's an Indigenous woman with Wonnarua and Kunya heritage. She said, as many of us remain frustrated with governments and their lack of progress to meet closing the gap targets, do you feel that an opportunity exists for the private sector to partner with First Nations communities in the pursuit of a more tangible and consistent change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always been the case, and there has been, leadership from the business sector. There's been the business council as well has been involved in the space and discussion for a while, and some would argue that they haven't done enough. But I think that there's always a role for the private sector. The private sector could, in fact, through mechanism, become, a lot more ethical and show by way of improving their values and connectivity to some of these issues. As we've seen, again, going back to the issue in the West with the unfortunate outcome of the destruction in Junkun Gorge and what that means for Rio Tinto. I mean, that's a clear example that the private sector should, in fact, provide the level of leadership. But again, I would caution that Indigenous people shouldn't just accept, the status quo or the lowest common denominator when it comes to agreement making, and accepting that just because you're with the private industry that they're going to be any better than government. So yes, they can provide a role, but in fact, they shouldn't supplement anyone else. They should be treated just the same, in my experience, as governments and other agents who want to deal with Indigenous First Nations peoples here in Australia.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think there is a question from Isabella. Lachlan, I might hand over to you. Are we putting Isabella into the call, or are we just going to ask that one?
Yeah, I'll just turn Isabella's video on now if she's happy with that. Just give me a moment.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks.
Hey, Isabella, go for it.
So I guess my question was about how, what in traditional practices can we integrate or adopt to create more circular and regenerative environmental practices going forward, like now, to also promote and encourage healing of oppressed people.
Tanya, did you want to go first, or you?
No, I'm definitely hoping you will go first.
Yeah, look, my experience is from Northern Australia largely, and if I could use the example of fire management, which affects all Australia, of course. I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that it's separate to agriculture, Indigenous agricultural techniques or those sorts of things, but in fact, fire is such a powerful tool for many reasons. And firstly, the thing to do is to unpack the reality that many Western mindsets have about fire being, this bad thing. When you think about fire, it's like the old adage that Muhammad Ali used to talk about, that everything black was bad and everything white was good. The reality is that fire is good. It's been in this landscape for a long time. It provides a whole range of purposes for Indigenous people, and there's not a separation between people in their country and these things, these phenomena like fire. They're a part of their worlds. So this sort of deep connection between people and their environments that have been built over tens of thousands of years have a lessons for, I think, all humanity. And using the example of fire is a thing that provides a whole lot of feedback for Aboriginal people. That could be around healing, it could be around spiritual cleansing, it could be around adopting young people into life, it could be around men's ceremonies, a whole host of interconnected reasons. And here in the southeast, there's a debate going on whether we should have fire in the landscape at all, even though we've just had these enormous events. So I think, firstly, changing the mindset of the population, and this is coming to the question of leadership, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, the question of fire being a good thing. It should not be seen as a bad thing, firstly, and then secondly, it should be adopted by all people, but particularly Aboriginal people who have got ancestral connections to those landscapes. Fire is an enormously powerful tool, as is a lot of other things that go on in country, but it allows people to get on their country and to manage it and to see it in a way that can only be articulated as being purely Indigenous in many ways, and that's at least my experience. So in terms of your question, I think there are a number of examples. I think we could sort of talk for a long period of time around what those examples might be, but I'm using fire as a particular one where, first we need to change the dial in terms of how people think about it. And secondly, we need to reinstate it and see that as a good thing and not necessarily a bad thing for all people. And where we see, everyone that's seen where we've had fires in Southeast Australia, there's been an amazing explosion of biodiversity back in a lot of those places. So there's a good reason to reinstate it for biophysical reasons in the landscape, but also for psychological reasons for people that are living there and Aboriginal people, but also people's ability to be on that country again and to feel that country again. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, Isabella, but it's a very complex area, I think, and I think it's a very pertinent question, and I hope I've sort of done something to answer that in some small way.
Definitely helps start to answer that question. I understand it's a very broad and big topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabella and Joe, for that contribution. I just wanted to add a little anecdote there too about fire management, because while I was down the coast recently, South Coast, getting my car fixed, I bumped into another black fella and we had a yarn, and I asked him, how are you guys going recovering from the fires? Were you affected? And where the area was completely decimated, he was telling me that his uncles and his elders waited for the wind to change as the fire was coming and lit from their balconies and their porches and lit out towards the fire, and burned fire enough that when the fire came, it just went around their houses and saved the houses. And things like this, just go to demonstrate the knowledge that's already there in the community and what happens when you give that seat at the table. So I think we've got a little bit time for maybe one more question. I just wanted to actually speak about this here. David hasn't really submitted a question. It's more of a statement, but I'm going to read it because I love it. He said, boomerang aerodynamics showed the world how to design propellers. I know that all of you fellas in the audience have got an uncle or an auntie that tells you that Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people invented just about everything there is in the world. But he goes on to say, each aerodome had their own boomerang club in the early days. Our approach to linguistics is also significant. Today, health provides major opportunities. Didgeridoo or Yiraki breathing techniques could be internationally significant at the moment. I just think that's an awesome contribution, and I wanted to read it out. Tanya and Joe, you don't need to speak on that one if you don't want to. I'm just going to have a little probe for one more question.
Lots of good points in that comment for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, just give me one moment. I think this is also a really good one. We've got a question from Samuel Wines. How can Western science appropriately engage with Indigenous peoples in a way that can maintain Indigenous knowledge sovereignty whilst building trustworthy relationships that allow scientists to become allies?
Well, I think the answer's in the question. It is about relationships. It's about building those relationships in a deep, meaningful and mutually respectful way, and that takes time and it takes ongoing commitment. Sometimes I think that people who have really great intentions in terms of wanting to engage with Aboriginal skills and knowledge want to treat Aboriginal people like a vending machine. So that I'll rock up and put some coins in and get what I need and be grateful and talk about how wonderful you all are, and then I'll be on my way, and you may never see me again. And I think that a number of people that I know have had similar experiences. Even I have, and certainly not at such a consequential level. But we've got to remember that how much trust has been broken over a long period of time in terms of the generous sharing by First Peoples in relation to their culture. How often Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will be congratulated and thanked for sharing their culture, their skills, their knowledge, but without any other sort of form of recognition in response to that. This knowledge base is ancient and should be cherished and is highly valuable and always at risk of being lost. And so I really do think that there's a lot of great people out there who do want to connect with those traditional practices to try and understand how it can advance the way that we live together going forward. To use some of those traditional practices to actually advance the current technologies we have. But you have to start with having the right relationship basis in order to do that. And that means respecting First Peoples as much as you say that you do, and making sure that they are appropriately recognised in all forms for the skills and knowledge they're sharing and the contributions that they are making. And I think it's just like any other relationship that you might have. If you're wanting that relationship to be meaningful, effective and sustained, you've got to respect it, and you've got to put the time and effort in to build that relationship. And there are examples where non-Indigenous people have done that and built very important relationships over the years with different Aboriginal groups, and you know, do get those results because of it. There's a lot that Indigenous peoples all over the world have to contribute, but you do need to do that in equal partnership, and that means having real relationships, not just relationships that are look good on the surface or on paper. They've got to have depth, they've got to be authentic, they've got to be genuine.
Thank you, Tanya. There's really not much I can add to that. Just, Joe, if there's anything you want to say before we wrap up, it's up to you. Otherwise,
no, I think I'm all right. I mean, there's been a lot of other questions on the question chat, and unfortunately, you know, some of those haven't been answered. So I'm not sure how we deal with that, but it'll be good to get some responses back to some of those questions.
Yeah,
very pertinent questions.
Is there any in there that you're looking at now that you were happy to take on?
I just responded to one from George about the Rights for Nature movement, which in many ways, in many places, Indigenous people are co-aligning that with their aspirations to achieve rights. And even here in Australia, there are some Indigenous leaders that are starting to take that view, particularly when their country is being threatened with, you know, water extraction, for example. So those things are there. There was also a question from Jess about native title and my thoughts about, or our thoughts about native title, which is a bit of a long conversation, but a very pertinent one. And, you know, native title is a very vexed issue and process here in Australia. And I think, unfortunately, it hasn't led to a lot of empowerment by Indigenous peoples that have been party to those negotiations. You know, and as a former CEO of a rep body, as well as a current claimant, I think that more could be done to be able to empower Aboriginal people, and I hope that things like the treaty making process could in effect replace some of those native title processes, where the onus on proof of connection is quite an abhorrent outcome, as we've seen in Yorta Yorta and the Larrakia in Darwin. So you know, it's not a very good system for a lot of people, but it does work for some people.
Thank you very much, Joe. Just on your point too about getting back to those other questions, we might see after the call if maybe we can address those in some way and get that to the panel, the audience out there. I know there's a few that went unanswered. I just want to say a really big thank you, Muraga Yinda, to Tanya and Joe for coming on this call and having a yarn with us. It's been awesome. I know I've learnt a lot, and hopefully all you guys out there in the audience can hopefully take something away from this. I'm just going to hand back to Lachlan to wrap us up.
Yeah, and definitely echo your words, Mal. Really want to thank Tanya, Joe, and also yourself, Mal, for your work in putting this together and in today's session. I think it went really well. I was really pleased to hear all the questions coming through, and we'll certainly follow up with everyone in the next week or so. We've recorded this session, so we'll be able to share that with you. And yeah, as Mal mentioned, we'll look to address some of those questions we couldn't get to as well. And on that, we really do hope that this can be the first of many more sessions. So, you know, potentially a whole session on native title or on climate or the power of sport. This was really an introduction to see the level of interest we could get, and you know, the thoughts of all of you. So yeah, I think some of those topics could definitely be covered on their own in a whole session. But yeah, look out for a follow-up from us, and we'll share details to be able to get in touch with us on social media or become a member, or however you want to get involved with the UNAA, and definitely feel free to contact us if there's more that you want to know, or if you have more further questions for Tanya, Joe, or Mal, we'd be happy to pass those on. So yeah, thanks again to everyone. I don't know if Joe and Tanya, just the last word from you. I think we're all have been really keen to hear from everything that you've said, so maybe just leave it with you for the last word.
I'll just quickly say thanks for providing the platform and opportunity. There's so many important conversations still to be had, but you've got to start. It was wonderful to see so many people interested enough to want to jump on another webinar, particularly in this period where I think so many of us are spending a lot of time doing that. Thank you for caring about the issues. Just encourage you to keep caring, to keep engaging, and thanks, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Lachlan and Mal for great moderation, and also Tanya for those responses as well. Really appreciate being allowed to be involved in a great conversation, and also those people that attended and provided questions as well. It's good to see.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the weekend, and we'll be in touch soon. And please do feel free to reach out if there's anything more that you want to know, any questions or ways you want to get involved. We want to make this into something that keeps going. We can have more of the same, and further discussions on more of those issues that you want to talk about. So look forward to doing more, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.